The deep rumble of the Harley cut through the morning silence as William glided through the still sleeping city streets. The first rays of sunlight began to touch the urban landscape, and he felt the cold wind on his face, a refreshing contrast to the suffocating heat that had seemed to settle into his life over the past few months. The city was changing just like him. William was no longer in a rush. There were no more races to get anywhere. Now his life followed the smooth rhythm of the Harley's engine, a road companion that offered him freedom and, above all, control. The decision to trade his car for a motorcycle felt symbolic. The car was practical, enclosed, safe, but it was also a prison, a reflection of how he had lived until then. Protected from the world, isolated from his emotions. The Harley, on the other hand, was an extension of his new philosophy of life. Without the barriers of a closed vehicle, he was exposed to the wind, the road, and, more importantly, to himself. With every mile traveled, William rediscovered a little more of himself, feeling a sort of rebirth. What might have been just a simple vehicle swap for others was, for him, the beginning of something much bigger. Mornings took on a new meaning. They became the most sacred time of the day, when he felt like the world was just starting to wake up, and for a few moments he could be part of something bigger than his worries. There was no traffic, no chaos, just him, his bike, and the city slowly waking up around him. The tranquility of these mornings brought a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Before work, William would stop at a cafe along the way, drinking his coffee slowly, savoring each sip as if it were his last. His routine now had a rhythm that brought him peace. The simplicity of the days seemed to heal wounds he didn't even know were still open. Work, once a refuge where he hid to avoid facing problems at home, became an extension of his reorganized life. He stood out not because he wanted to prove himself, but because he had finally found a balance that allowed him to be himself in all aspects. Deep down, what William desired most now was stability. After years of emotional chaos, it felt like for the first time he was in control of his own destiny. And the motorcycle in some way symbolized that. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a constant reminder that he was in control. Yet, despite this peace, there was always a shadow, a weight at the back of his mind. The feeling that something was still coming, something he couldn't avoid but for now preferred not to face. His past, though left behind, hadn't been completely silenced. However, in that moment he didn't want to think about it. In that moment he was free. Despite the appearance of freedom, William knew that his new solitary life came at a cost. The peaceful mornings on the Harley and the organized days at work were a facade that masked something deeper. At the end of each journey, when the sun began to set behind the city buildings, the reality of loneliness became palpable. The walls of his small house, carefully organized like his new routine, seemed to slowly close in. The silence William so valued in the morning turned into an unsettling echo at night. His choice of solitude hadn't been accidental. After the bitter breakup with Alice, his ex-wife, William felt he needed time to understand who he was without the shadow of someone beside him. Alice had been a significant part of his life, but also the source of deep wounds. Her betrayals and lies not only broke their marriage, but also shattered William's trust in people. The pain of the separation made him build a kind of wall around himself, a defense against further disappointment. And, in many ways, the motorcycle fit perfectly into that. There was no space for anyone else but him. Sometimes, on particularly difficult nights, William would walk through the city as if searching for something or someone. Although he knew he had no clear answer for what he was looking for, he'd stop at bars, restaurants, or cafes but rarely talked to anyone. He simply observed people, absorbing the energy around him without truly participating in it. He had become good at this, being present yet always on the sidelines. Even at work, where he was respected and admired, William kept an emotional distance. He was efficient, focused, and a natural leader, but he avoided getting too involved with his colleagues. There was always a boundary he imposed, a line no one could cross. During the day this worked perfectly. He filled his time with tasks, meetings, and decisions that demanded his attention. But at night, when work was over, the weight of his choices would return. At home, he devoted himself to small projects. Renovating the kitchen had been one of those. He spent weeks transforming the space into something that reflected his new life, simple but functional. He enjoyed the feeling of completing something with his own hands, something he could control. Like the motorcycle, these projects were a way to reaffirm control over his life. Another refuge was building a personal gym at home, where he spent hours training, channeling his pent-up energy and maintaining discipline, as he had learned in his youth through Kung Fu. Yet, as much as these hobbies and projects occupied his time, they didn't fill the void. He avoided confronting it directly, but introspection became inevitable, especially on longer nights when the silence of the house was too heavy to ignore. He thought of Alice, of course, but also of all the other connections he had avoided or destroyed over the years, either out of fear of getting hurt again or because he felt he didn't need anyone anymore. Still, there was a strange satisfaction in his new life. William wasn't unhappy. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of who he was and what he wanted. The problem was that he still didn't know exactly what that meant, but for now it was enough. It was a cloudy afternoon, the kind of day when the light never seems to decide between gray and golden. William was sitting in a cafe, absent-mindedly looking out at the street when he heard a familiar voice that made him shiver inside. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Alice. She was standing in front of him, with the same confidence as always, as if the years and the pain they had shared were nothing more than a distant chapter of their lives. "William," she said with a hesitant smile, "can I sit down?" William took a moment before answering. Time seemed to freeze as he decided what to do, the shock of seeing her after so long mixed with a flood of emotions he had buried. But he nodded, allowing her to sit across from him. There was no escaping this now. Alice, the woman he had loved and lost at the same time, was back. But why? She began to speak with the same soft voice he remembered, explaining how things had changed since the separation. Alice mentioned her attempts to reconnect with her life, the therapies, the moments of reflection, and finally the regret. She wasn't there to apologize directly. William knew that wasn't her style, but there was something different in her words. Alice spoke of redemption, of how she had revisited the past and acknowledged the harm she had caused. William listened, but at the same time, his mind was elsewhere. Memories flooded back like a slow-motion film. The good times they shared, the promises of a future together, followed by the dark days of betrayal, lies, and the painful divorce. He remembered sleepless nights trying to understand where things had fallen apart. And now, here she was back talking about reconciliation, about closing old wounds and maybe starting over. For a moment, William wondered if that was possible. Could he simply forgive, go back to where they were, and pretend the scars had vanished? He wasn't sure if he was strong enough for that. Alice continued, mentioning how their relationship had always been something special, something she had never been able to forget. She was seeking a chance for redemption, but William couldn't help questioning her true intentions. Was she really remorseful, or was this just another attempt to manipulate the situation, as she had done so many times before? William took a deep breath and looked at Alice closely. He realized that despite the pretty words, there was something calculated in her approach, a trait he knew all too well. She was asking for another chance, but she didn't seem willing to fully open up about the mistakes she had made. In that moment, William realized the depth of his own transformation. He was no longer the man Alice knew. The William who had suffered in silence and clung to the hope that she would change no longer existed. "Alice," he said calmly, interrupting her, "I've changed. And I think you have too, but not in the way you think." Alice fell silent. The hesitant smile disappeared from her face. William didn't want to be cruel, but he knew that regardless of her words, something had broken between them, something irreparable. The weight of the past was still there, and no matter how much they tried to rebuild, the cracks would always remain. She tried once more, saying that things could be different this time, that they could try again with more maturity. But William had already made his decision. He knew that going back would mean reliving the pain, and he wasn't willing to sacrifice his peace for a ghost of the past. "I need to move on," he said, his voice firm but without hostility. "And you should too." Alice looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand who this new William in front of her was. Finally, she stood up, murmuring something about how she had expected a different answer. William said nothing as he watched her leave the cafe, her figure disappearing into the crowd. The reunion he had never asked for now seemed like turning a page, and he felt strangely relieved that he remained seated for a while longer, watching life continue around him as normal. The sense of closure was strong, but at the same time, he knew that the future was still uncertain, and that was something he was finally ready to face. Days after the meeting with Alice, William decided it was time to return to his routine. He got up early that morning, put on his helmet, and once again let the sound of the Harley and the wind on his face reconnect him with the present. But something was different. Instead of heading to work as usual, he took another route. It was a small change of course without any planning. He headed toward a cafe he used to pass by but rarely stopped at. Maybe by instinct, maybe by a need to escape what still haunted him, he decided he needed a break there, in that cafe. Amidst the aroma of ground coffee beans and scattered voices, he saw her for the first time, and she was sitting alone, with an open book in front of her and a nearly untouched cup of coffee beside her. Unlike other women William had met, she seemed completely absorbed in herself, oblivious to the movement around her. There was something in her posture, in the way she held the book, that intrigued him. Without thinking too much, William ordered his coffee and sat a few meters away from her. He tried to focus on his own coffee, but his eyes kept drifting back to Anne. Without him realizing it, after a few minutes, a silly accident, a customer bumping into her table, knocked Anne's book to the ground. Without hesitation, William got up and picked it up. "Are you okay?" he asked, handing the book back to her, and smiled, a light but genuine smile. "Yes, I'm fine, thank you." And that's how the conversation began. No rush, no expectations. They talked about the book she was reading, a work about travel and motorcycles, something that immediately sparked William's interest. "I ride a bike too," he commented, trying not to sound too enthusiastic, and seemed interested. And as the conversation flowed, William realized there was something different about this woman. She was calm yet engaging, with an aura of serenity that contrasted with the emotional turmoil he still felt inside. They met several more times after that day, always casually, never in a rush. The connection between them grew organically, as if each conversation brought them closer. And with her love for literature and motorcycles, seemed like the perfect person for the phase of life William was in. He didn't feel pressure, didn't feel the need to prove anything. It was as if, for the first time, he could be himself with someone. Although he hadn't mentioned Alice in their first meetings, William knew the subject would come up eventually. When it did, it was natural. He told Anne about the reunion with his ex-wife, about the betrayal, the divorce, and the attempt at reconciliation that he had refused, and listened in silence, without judgment. When he finished, she simply nodded and said, "We all have our ghosts. What matters is what we decide to do after them." Those words echoed in William's mind, and wasn't trying to heal him nor to replace what he had lost. She simply accepted him as he was, with all the scars he carried. And that, for William, was something completely new. As the days passed, they began to see each other more often. William was surprised by how easily things flowed between them. The long conversations, the motorcycle rides, the moments shared in silence, and brought lightness to his life. A lightness he hadn't known he needed but that now became indispensable. The Harley, which once symbolized his independence and solitude, now carried a different meaning. With and riding along, the road seemed less lonely and more full of possibilities, but as well as things were going with Anne, William still carried a certain hesitation inside him. He knew that, to truly move forward, he would have to make peace with the past. However, in that moment, he chose to allow himself something he hadn't done in a long time: hope. Maybe finally, he was ready to trust again. The days continued to pass, and William found himself increasingly torn. On one hand, his connection with Anne deepened with each meeting, each unassuming conversation, each motorcycle ride through the city with no destination. On the other hand, the shadow of Alice still loomed over his mind, like an emotional debt he had never fully paid. And now, besides the turbulent past, he faced a new deal: and the growing responsibility at work. William had recently been promoted. The new leadership position was something he had fought for over the years, but now it seemed to bring with it an avalanche of new pressures and expectations. He found himself responsible for mediating conflicts, motivating a diverse team, and most importantly, making decisions that would impact many people's lives. It wasn't an easy task. In the first few days, he believed he could balance it all and work the weight of the past. He thought he could handle everything, but slowly, the pressures began to intertwine in a way he hadn't expected. One morning, just before an important team meeting, he received an unexpected message. It was from Alice. She had sent a brief, almost cold message saying she wanted to talk to him again. It rattled him. During the meeting, he found himself distracted. His colleague's words passed by him like a blur while his mind kept returning to Alice's message. What else did she want? Wasn't it enough that she had reappeared out of nowhere? Now, she wanted another conversation. William knew that any further interaction with her would only reopen wounds he was desperately trying to keep closed. But that wasn't all. And was also present in his thoughts. As a counterpoint to the confusion Alice represented, every time he thought about responding to Alice's message, he remembered Anne's smile, the calm she brought to his life. William knew that Anne was his chance at a new beginning, a chance to leave the past behind. But how could he fully move on if he still felt that something remained unresolved with Alice? As if personal illness weren't enough, work began demanding more from William than he had expected. Complex projects landed on his desk, and his team, competent as they were, often found themselves in disagreement over the best way to move forward. William was forced to mediate these discussions and make difficult decisions that didn't always please everyone. The pressure began to mount, and work, once a source of stability, was now becoming another responsibility weighing on his shoulders. On one of those stressful days, after another long and conflict-filled meeting, William met Anne at the cafe where they usually met. She immediately noticed something was wrong. "Are you okay?" she asked, with the gentleness he had come to appreciate. William took a deep breath, thinking about how to answer. He didn't want to bring the weight of his problems into his relationship with Anne, but he also knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. "It's work," he finally said. But they both knew it wasn't just that. They talked for a while, and Anne, like always, was understanding. She spoke about how difficult moments are inevitable, but that running from them wasn't the solution. That resonated with William in a way he hadn't expected. Running, that's what he had been doing. Not just with Alice, but with every situation in his life that bothered him. He had built a routine that, while it brought some peace, was still a way to avoid dealing with the ghosts of the past. But now those ghosts were forcing their way in work, Alice, and everything seemed to be converging toward a breaking point. And William knew he would have to make choices. He couldn't keep living in two worlds, stuck between the past and the present, torn between the hope of a future with Anne and the weight of unresolved issues with Alice. And then, as he looked at and sitting across from him, something began to clear up inside William. He knew he couldn't keep avoiding the hard decisions. Life was no longer about running away on the Harley or living a quiet routine. It was time to face everything head-on. He just didn't know yet how he was going to do it. That night, after his meeting with Anne, William went home with his mind in turmoil. He knew he couldn't keep putting off the decisions that lay before him. The weight of Alice and everything she represented, the depth of his connection with Anne, and the growing pressure at work were about to collide in an inevitable way. He needed to make a choice, a definitive choice that would determine the course of his life. But how could he choose between the familiar comfort of the past and the hope of an uncertain future? The next day, as he prepared for yet another meeting at work, something inside William snapped. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and saw the exhaustion written on his face. The promotion, which should have been an achievement, was becoming a constant source of stress. The responsibilities, which he once saw as challenges, were now burdens that weighed on his soul. He wasn't being fair to himself, to his team, or to Anne. He needed to resolve what was left unresolved in his personal life before it destroyed the little piece he had managed to find out he had left. And so, without thinking much, William picked up the phone and called Alice. He knew he needed to end this once and for all. The conversation was brief. Alice, initially surprised that he had called, tried to convince him that they could try again, that maybe with time and patience, things could go back to the way they were before. But William, now more resolute than ever, interrupted her. "Alice, what we had was important. It was real. But it's over. I'm not the man you knew anymore. And you're not the woman I loved. We've gone down different paths, and it's time to accept that." On the other end of the line, there was a long silence. Alice seemed to be processing his words. She tried to argue, but William had already made his decision. He said goodbye, thanking her for the good times they had shared, but making it clear that there was no going back. When he hung up the phone, he felt an immense relief, as if he had finally cut the last tie that bound him to the past. With the closure of that chapter, William knew there was still one more decision to be made. He was more aware than ever that and represented a new beginning, a chance for something different, something genuine. But he also knew that entering this relationship meant being fully present, without the distractions and burdens of the past. He would need to be honest with her, not just about what he had decided regarding Alice, but also about what he wanted for the future. That night he invited her to dinner at his house. As he prepared the meal, William felt his heart racing, but not out of nervousness. It was a different kind of anxiety, the anticipation of something good, something real. When it arrived, he greeted her with a smile that conveyed something she hadn't seen yet. Clarity. After dinner, as they talked in the living room, William finally opened up. He told her about the call with Alice, the decision he had made, and how he was ready to move on, and listened attentively as she always did. But this time, there was something different in the air. William wasn't just sharing his choices. He was inviting and to be part of the future he wanted to build. "I want to move forward he said. "And I want you to be part of that if you want. But I need to be honest, work has been a major source of stress, and I'm in the middle of a storm there too. I don't want that to affect what we have." And looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "William, I'm not here to solve your problems. I'm here because I see something in you that makes me want to stay. Life will never be easy, but if we're in this together, we can face anything." Those words echoed within William like an anchor. He knew in that moment that he had found something special. It wasn't the promise of a perfect life, but the reality that, together, they could build something genuine. For the first time in years, he felt that he wasn't alone. Days later, they decided to plan a trip, not a getaway but a celebration of what they were building. A motorcycle trip along the coast with no fixed destination, just the two of them, the road and the future. As he put on his helmet and heard the familiar rumble of the Harley, William smiled. The freedom he had sought for so long finally made sense. It wasn't about running away but about living fully, and so with and by his side, he moved forward, free from the shackles of the past and with an open heart for what lay ahead.